before 1861 is often referred to as a serf society. In reality, nearly half of all peasants were not serfs. That is to say, they were not actual property of any private owners. Rather, they were considered state property, paid taxes to the state, lived on state-owned land, and were therefore called state peasants. Interestingly, just as there was something of a social hierarchy within the commoner class of Edo, there too existed a set of divisions among these state peasants. The largest subgroup was the black plowing people, who had been in Russia for hundreds of years. Next were the one homesteaders, who were the descendants of serfs from centuries before. They were followed by military residents, whose ancestors had defended the state in prior wars, and finally by church-owned peasants, a group belonging to the church which numbered nearly 1 million throughout Russia at its peak. Each of these subgroups was given certain rights. Some were allowed to submit complaints to the government, while others were not. Some could be sold as serfs. Some could own serfs of their own. As we know, there was a similar hierarchy in Edo, with samurai, artisans, craftsmen, merchants, and so on. So immediately we see a comparison between the two societies. However, one important distinction is that, as far as we were taught, Edo's social hierarchy was exclusive to that city, a product of its own societal constructs. In contrast, this state-peasant hierarchy in Moscow was a universal social condition that existed in all of Russia until the emancipation of serfs in 1861. Another difference between the nature of these two hierarchies is that the Russian set of divisions was entirely based on one's history or one's past, what his or her ancestors did. On the other hand, Edo's hierarchies were largely occupation-based. Regardless, although interclass mobility in Edo was possible, both systems seemed very stratified. These observations must make one wonder whether the presence of a social hierarchy is a necessary element, or rather, if it is an outcome, of a successful growing city. We've discussed that Moscovian peasants lived primarily in cottages outside of the walls of the city, and that elites resided in vast estates near the Kremlin. Between these two lay industrial buildings and homes for the middle class. These were mainly single-story houses, never escalating past 2 floors, with private gardens and stone walls surrounding them. Two aspects instantly stand out in contrast to Edo city houses. Firstly, in Edo, many buildings of the chonin were 2 stories, with stores at the bottom and homes for their owners or tenants above them. This was certainly not the case in Moscow. I would suggest that the reason for this is that, while in Edo much of the commercial activity took place in the Cho, in Moscow everyone headed downtown towards Red Square to buy and sell their goods. So there was no reason to have street-front stores when most of the economic activity was taking place in one centralized location. The second difference we notice is revealed through the private gardens and walls surrounding the homes in Moscow. Clearly, a sense of community, while strong in areas like Red Square, disappeared in the residential areas of the city. While Edo homes usually shared a common garden, well, an outhouse, it appears as though Muscovites were relatively self-secluded and isolated. Perhaps the wall surrounding the home is an outcome of the fact that, for 4 centuries, hardly one generation could pass by without someone in it having to defend itself against some sort of foreign invasion. So, maybe the idea of self-defense and secure perimeters was simply an inherent notion in the very character of Muscovites. Recall that earlier I mentioned that, when the nobles focused much of their city planning towards the center of the town, class divisions were even further compounded. Here I'd like to discuss these divisions further. Essentially, Moscow suffered from a significant gap between the few elites and the many commoners. This would be easily visible if, for example, we started walking radially outward from the Kremlin in Moscow in 1808. Starting at Red Square, surrounded by very many majestic buildings, we would proceed through the vast openness and grandeur of the gardens and fountains of the noble estates. Before long, though, we would encounter the mediocrity of common life. That is not to say, of course, that common Muscovites had no culture, no vibrance, no worth. The point is that there existed this tangible friction between the majesty of the nobles and the poorness of their subjects, a friction which eventually forced the state to prohibit serfdom in the mid-19th century. These quotations best sum up this idea. William Libby says that Moscow is a most curious mixture of the grand and the miserable. And Albert Schmidt notes that here are miraculous mansions with coats of arms where a famous family is crowned, and near them, shacks on chicken legs. Comparatively, this is intriguing because many travelers to Tokyo today notice a similar pattern to that described by Libby and Schmidt of Moscow then. They mention how the neon lights and latest technology of modern Tokyo streets starkly contrast the small, modest alleys that intersect them. economy, then, is present today just as it was in Moscow 200 years ago. And it begs the question, is it even possible for such a significant socio-economic difference not to be present in the growing city? Questions like these are exactly why comparing historical maps and the cities they depict has academic value. Both Edo in 1803 and Moscow in 1808 have remarkably similar traits as well as telling differences between their layouts. And through these comparisons we can delve into a host of further explorations and explanations of social, cultural, and physical aspects of the cities. Throughout this presentation, I've touched on these three areas to the best of my ability in an attempt to establish a foundation upon which the academic community, if so interested, could conduct further studies to learn more about the comparative nature of the history of major cities. Thank you very much for listening, and the next two slides will just be a brief overview of the sources I used in my